Topla. So most of this stuff actually is from the fire on the outside. When I doused it, I suppressed the fire, put the fire out, and ended up with the charcoal on the outside, but the inside's all still wood, of course. Not a complete burn on the inside of the can either. The outside and the top were good, but the center of the pile was not good, which means I just didn't leave the fire burning long enough. It was going for maybe 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, and really need at least a couple of hours of burning to get that entire can charred without actually burning it to ash. So I'll do another batch, clean this all up, get all this bark or this charcoal onto the compost pile, and then I'll refill that can. And this evening, when the wind dies down and the temperature drops, I'll do another batch, and that might be enough for this year. And then I'll do another couple of batches probably later in the year that I can put onto the garden next spring. How do you like the black flies? They're just getting bad now because the weather is getting quite warm and dry actually this week. So hopefully it's a fairly short bug season, but they don't bite very much at this time of year when they first start hatching. I'm not sure if it's the early breed or I don't know. Anyway, they look more bothersome than they actually are. But that being said, I'm about to make the bug spray that I started when winter. Whenever I made that birch tar, the purpose of that was to put it on me as a bug repellent, but I'm mixing that with bear fat. So I've got all that grease that I rendered down last fall from the bear that was given to me. So I've got not sure how many liters of that bear lard, which I use for cooking, baking, but also for base for the creams and stuff that I make for my skin and for like healing salves and stuff. So I'll be putting that on probably today if these bugs get thicker or they start biting, or both. Anyway, the biochar, you can see behind me, I'm finally getting some plants in the ground into the little garden that I created last year, or the previous fall. Cabin's right there. So this is more of my kitchen garden, but I'm making major strides here around the cabin itself with the some future plans for a major kitchen garden right here. So that's going to start in probably, I think, in July. So the front of this area is going to change dramatically. My wood shed's going to change. My fire pit, it's all going to be moved to accommodate the food expansion, food growing expansion that I'm doing on the homestead. So busy year. You'll see behind me, you've seen earlier in this video, biochar. So or the charcoal is what you're seeing me make, and the reason for that is it's just a fancier name for charcoal when it's used in the garden, but it's referred to as biochar. Anyway, these soils were discovered in certain areas in the Amazonian rainforest that were super productive, and the soils were black, and compared to the rest of the ground that was brown or gray, even like you see most of the dirt in the forest here. And it was the Portuguese, I think, who rediscovered this soil, and they named it Terra, preta, which basically means black soil, black earth. So what they discovered when they analyzed that, these deposits of black soil, is that it was created intentionally by Amazonian tribes or cultures, civilizations. They did that to improve the soil in order for the soil to be more productive and pretty well timelessly productive. Now, when you clear forests, as I've done here, apparently it only takes a couple of years to deplete all the nutrients out of it by planting crops and harvesting the nutrients in the form of fruits and vegetables to eat and taking out of the land and out of that soil. So you need to replenish that somehow. In today's modern farming methods, of course, we use artificial fertilizers for the most part. And they say within 50 or 60 years we won't have any nutrients left in any of our soils where we grow our current fruits and vegetables that feed the world. Grains too, mainly grains, or a lot of grains, let's put it that way, corn and wheat and stuff like that, and then of course soybeans on top of that. So what we're headed towards is sort of crisis of soil, a soil crisis. And the Amazonians discovered that when they stayed in one area, rather than continue to lead nomadic lives where they kept moving from place to place, that they had to find a way to get the soil to hold those nutrients. And likely it was discovered by accident. So any fires that they would have had, cooking fires, all the nutrients that were left around the kitchen area, the cooking areas, the villages, such as like their own manure, urine, all the food scraps, bones, anything that was left on the land got absorbed, of course, by the land and ended up adding nutrients. So whether or not it was intentional or it was just discovered accidentally, these lands around the villages became more and more productive compared to the surrounding forests and fields, and or forests mainly. So scientists have done analysis on these soils and I've realized this land that was sort of improved intentionally or unintentionally by humans was creating a fertile zone based on this concentration of nutrients brought in from the surrounding forest into one area. And the basis of the black soil and what made this soil particularly nutrient rich and productive was the charcoal that was in that soil. And what they found in the most productive soils, it was up to 9% by volume, 9% charcoal compared to all the other components of the soil itself. So that's pretty significant. And I'm not a scientist, and I certainly haven't done enough research to speak intelligently about this, but if you want to look up Terra preta and or Biochar to learn more about it, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about and what this is. So I found that out maybe 10 years ago when I was researching the most productive way or the most efficient way to go from no garden in my backyard and the farm that we rented to highly productive garden as quickly as possible. So I brought in all kinds of nutrients, and one of those things was creating charcoal and putting that into the ground, and the ash that goes with it, so the white ash from a fire pit. And when I started this garden last year, 2 years ago, I cut all these trees down and burned them in place so that ash would be added to the soil, and also all this charcoal that remained would serve that function. Now, this much bigger garden that I'm working on right now needs a lot of enrichment, and I think the soil is going to be decent this year, but I know over the next couple of years I need to like supercharge that soil as much as possible. So the compost pile, which is comprised of not only all the typical things in a compost pile, but all that biochar, all that charcoal that I made, is going into that compost pile, and it's going to be big and create an amazing nutrient dense compost that I can then spread or till into the gardens. They'll do that continuously, basically starting in the next couple of weeks, and then throughout the next few years I'll just continue creating biochar, creating amazing compost, bringing in nutrients whenever I can from the outside, like you saw earlier in this video, the manure that I brought in, that's cow and goat manure that we got from our friends, farmer friends. So I'll continue doing that. Moose manure that I keep bringing in, there's still tons of it here. I'll just keep adding it, mainly to this garden and the greenhouse, I think. And yeah, it's going to be a multi-year process of building up the nutrients on the homestead, but also making this completely self-sufficient, way further, way more developed than I had ever planned for this place to be. And I think this latest event has caused our family to look at it more collectively and make a decision together to expand this place to be, expand our entire life to be more self-sufficient as a whole and as a family. Anyway, I thought I should share that with you. I often do things that are maybe confusing on this channel, and most of the time I try to resolve the questions that you have by the end of each video or by the end of the series. But in this case, you probably have questions that you'd like answered as quickly as you can, especially if you're starting your own garden this year. But keep in mind, as I always remind everybody, I'm not an expert. I am learning this. I do a lot of research, and I put a lot of sweat equity and energy into all my projects to learn as much as I can personally, hands-on as possible. But I'm just referring to other people's research and people that have come before me for the most part. So if you're interested in gardening, please do more research and find more experienced people to follow and to learn from, but also specifically biochar. There's lots of videos now and lots of books and scientific papers actually that will tell you more about it. So that being said, I have some fish and some turkey to cook up that I'll probably have in the next video, I guess. Been a pretty decent week for food acquisition, wild foods this week and planting. So now to the pile, what I've added is, of course, the turkey remains and the fish remains. But this layer right here is from the down by the water, the swampy area. It's not as algae filled as I thought it would be. It's probably 2-3 more days of this hot weather with the bright sunshine to get that algae really blooming in the stream, in the stagnant parts of the stream. So this is mostly peat, some water with algae in it, some moss from the a different kind of moss on rotten logs, and that's really rotten wood from the forest floor. So a lot of nitrogen and other nutrients in all of this stuff that I just added on top, but a lot of moisture as well, and that's going to help break down this rest of this nitrogen and carbon really quickly. So I think within 2 weeks, if I can keep adding especially swamp water to it and turning it, I'll be able to use this within 2 weeks. So the purpose of this really, I mean, I'm going to have multiple compost piles with a variety of materials, including one that's more alkaline and one that's more acidic, so more pine needles and peat moss and stuff in one pile, and other types of stuff in the other pile. But the purpose of adding the charcoal to this mix, that biochar, is that the biochar, so that piece of charcoal right there is pretty well inert. So I took that right out of the fire pit, and put it onto this pile. So there's no nutrients in that right now. What happens is that it starts absorbing nutrients as the especially liquid nutrients, start encapsulating this. It starts to absorb those. So if you put it directly into the garden, it's absorbing all of those nutrients out of your soil and away from your plants. So you need to charge it. Best way to do that is actually to use a liquid compost. So if I take these metal garbage bins and I put the charcoal in there with some fish emulsion, or just fish and water and stuff like that, it'll absorb those nutrients, and it'll do it fairly quickly. And actually the absolute proper way to do it safely and efficiently is to put an aerator, a bubbler in there to get the water really roiling, so it doesn't become an anaerobic compost. So you get a lot of aerobic activity, which creates healthier bacteria. But in my case, I don't have that, and I don't have, well, water is more of an issue for me than biomass. So in my case, best way for me to do it is just to put it right in the compost pile. Finished compost would have been better, but I put it right in this pile since I don't have any. Let it all compost together, and all those nutrients will end up getting sucked up by the soil and the charcoal in particular. And then there's ash in here as well to keep the acidity down, so keep the alkalinity up so it doesn't become too acid for my plants. So for the last couple of years, I've just been dumping all my food scraps, all the waste, behind the forest kitchen or different areas around the cabin, like cooking water and all that kind of stuff. I've just been dumping it in the snow all winter, for example. So all of that has accumulated all around the cabin and the kitchen, and that's a good example of what would happen in indigenous cultures. The fertility immediately around the kitchen areas especially, and then the villages, would be a lot richer because all of that organic material is being added into the soil at a convenience mostly, but ends up being beneficial. So that's what I've been doing. Now I need to start focusing that. So beside the cabin, I'll create more of a compost pile so that I can immediately amend the greenhouse soil. I'm gonna have to build raised beds in that greenhouse and amend or add that soil in there. So looking forward to that. But anyway, that's what I'm doing to increase productivity. I think this garden is going to be not a failure this year, but it's not going to be all that productive. And I think the main reason, 2 reasons, is that I ended up digging up a lot of the subsoil to get enough soil, and that doesn't have much nutrients, and it has very poor water holding, moisture holding capacity. So what I'm seeing is that these beds are drying out. My greens, the lettuces I planted 3 weeks ago, despite the cold weather, should have been up and edible by now, but the soil is just drying out too quickly. So I have to add a ton of organic material, and instead of just composting leaves, I need to cover the entire garden in leaves as a mulch to keep holding that moisture. Although it seems probably enough bugs. If I just kill a bunch of black flies, I can probably cover the whole garden. It's getting bad. It's a hot week this week, so we're going to peak in the next day or two with these bugs. Anyway, that's my challenges. So not so productive a garden this year, but what I'm doing is laying a foundation for my future self-reliance, and that's what I've always touted on my channel, on my website, and on my other social media accounts, is that when you have the time and you have the resources, you have the money, use that to start building up your self-reliance. And that's been my focus. I've had some really bad years financially, had some good years financially, and some stable years. And what I'm trying to do is, as I get a little bit of money, get extra money, I'm using it to invest in my future. And this garden is a good example. And the other things I'm going to be doing around the cabin are a good example of that as well. So as far as what I'm putting into the compost piles, if you've been followed along and saw it right from the beginning, the bottom layer, I had some sticks to keep it off the ground a little bit to get some air under there. A lot of those were charred from the incomplete burn from my biochar experiment here. Then I have a layer of biochar, or leaves, then a layer of biochar, and then I started layering the dried leaves, biochar, some manure, composted manure from our friend, all the animal manure, so deer droppings and moose droppings. We haven't had much green up. It's just starting to green. You can probably see in the trees behind me now. So I haven't been able to get any green plant matter to add to it. That's going to change over the next couple of days, and I'll start adding a ton of that, especially from the swampy areas. So I'll get a lot of algae in there, a lot of water plants. That's going to speed up the decomposition process. So there's a lack of greenery in here. All the kitchen scraps have gone in. The animal scraps, so a few fish remains. The other wild turkey went into one of the main beds. So this is only one wild turkey remains in here. Lots of not lots, but moss, peat moss, rotted logs, lots of mushroom, like turkey tail mushroom, dried up, that was in the logs and stuff. So a lot of organic material, and I'll be adding another layer of char on top of that, like I said. And these bones, all the bones that Callie's had over the last couple of years that have been accumulating around the cabin, I'm going to break these up, crush them up, and add that as bone meal to this as well. So a ton of different things, ton of different types of nutrients. So I'll get calcium and magnesium, and then the 3 nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's going to be a really, really rich compost. And I'll have to just spread that on top for this year and let it leach in and allow it to hold moisture for the plants to grow properly. So that's unfortunate that I didn't get it in before the garden, or into the beds before the plants went in. But next year is going to be super productive, I think, because on top of all the compost I'm creating, I'm also growing a lot of green manures. So like comfrey, I've got a few comfrey things and a bunch of seeds that are going in now that the weather's warmed up. I've got lots of beans growing for eating, but also for just adding nitrogen back into the soil. Whole bunch of things, clover, stuff like that, so I can start adding my own greenery back into the soils. So that's my plan. Well, I think that's it for this video. I'm going to get back to work. I need to suppress the odor from this pile. Callie's sniffing around it, so I know obviously if she smells it, the bears are going to smell it. I haven't seen a bear yet this spring, surprisingly. By the 3rd week of May, usually I've seen several by now. Now I know they're out, obviously, and they're about, but just haven't had them close to me. So in order to stop them from being interested in this pile or coming in and wrecking the fence to get into it, well, the fence is not even done all the way around, so they can just walk in. But if I cover this in more soil or animal droppings, and then get another layer, I'm going to do another carbon burn here. If I get another layer of carbon on top of that, that should suppress most of the smell and hopefully deter any animals, raccoons or bears in particular, from getting in. So I'm going to get at that, and I will see you at the cabin next time. Take care.